The great hall of the Concord War Council on Aetheris Prime had never been this quiet, and the silence was not the peaceful kind, but the kind that came after too many defeats and too many dead fleets and too many shattered hopes. 34 species sat around the curved table that stretched across the chamber like a crescent moon, and every single one of them carried the weight of a war they were losing, and had been losing for decades, against an enemy that did not stop, and did not negotiate, and did not show mercy. The Vraxith Dominion had taken another 12 systems in the last solar cycle alone, and with each conquered world, they grew stronger, because that was what the Vraxith did, and they consumed everything, and turned it into more soldiers, and more ships, and more hunger. High Commander Zorath of the Peleni stood at the center of the chamber, and his forearms were trembling as he delivered the latest report. And his voice cracked when he said that Fleet Group Orion had been destroyed at the border of the Tessari Expanse, with all hands lost, and no survivors recovered, and no distress signals received, because the Vraxith had jammed everything before they attacked. That was 3 major fleets gone in a single cycle, and the room knew it, and nobody wanted to say what everyone was thinking, which was that this war was no longer winnable. The Vraxith had fortified the Kessara corridor with over 12,000 warships and dozens of orbital hive stations, the size of small moons, and that corridor was the only path connecting Concord space to their besieged core colonies, and as long as the Vraxith held it, those colonies would slowly starve and fall, one by one, like fruit rotting on a dying tree. Counselor Drethon of the Morvathi slammed his armored fist against the table, and the sound rang through the chamber like a gunshot, and he demanded action, and he demanded a full assault, and he said his people were warriors, and they would not sit here and wait for death to come to them. But the numbers did not lie, and everyone knew that a direct assault on the Kessara corridor would require a fleet 3 times the size of anything the Concord could assemble, and even then the casualties would be catastrophic, and the chance of success was less than 15%, according to every simulation they had run. That was when Ambassador Thalvine of the Silurians rose from her seat at the far end of the table, and the Silurians were among the oldest species in the Concord, with a civilization stretching back nearly 4 million years. And when Thalvine spoke, people listened, even when they did not want to hear what she had to say. She proposed something that made half the room flinch and the other half laugh, and what she proposed was requesting military aid from the United Terran Federation, humanity. The reaction was immediate and loud, and Drethon was the first to speak, and he did not hide his contempt when he called humanity a species of children who had barely learned to walk among the stars, and he asked what a civilization only 300 years into spaceflight could possibly offer against an enemy that had devoured empires older than human recorded history. Others echoed his words, and the Paleni delegate called humans reckless, and the Korvathi delegate called them unstable, and the Yethani delegate simply said they were too young and too small and too fragile to matter in a conflict of this scale. Thalvine waited for the noise to die down, and then she activated a holographic display that showed intelligence reports her people had been gathering for the past 2 decades, and what those reports showed made the laughter stop. Humanity had not been idle during their time as observers in the Concord, and while the galaxy had dismissed them as primitive newcomers, the humans had been building something, and they had been building it quietly, and they had been building it with a constant watch, focus, and intensity that Thalvine described as deeply unsettling. The intelligence services of 6 different Concord species had attempted to penetrate a classified human initiative known only as Project Ironclad, and all 6 had failed completely, and the humans had not even bothered to protest or file diplomatic complaints about the espionage attempts, which Thalvine said was perhaps the most alarming detail of all, because it meant they were so confident in their security that they simply did not care. What the Silurian Intelligence Network had managed to determine was that Earth's orbital shipyards, and those of its colony worlds, had been running at full production capacity for 15 consecutive years. And the energy output alone suggested a military buildup of extraordinary scale. But beyond that, the details were a black void. The council debated for hours, and voices rose and fell, and threats were made, and alliances were tested. But in the end, the vote passed by the thinnest of margins, because the truth was simple and brutal and undeniable, and the truth was that they had no other option. A formal request for military assistance was transmitted to Earth. 12 light-years away, on a blue and green world that most of the galaxy still considered insignificant, the message arrived at UTF High Command in Geneva. And it was received by Fleet Admiral Elara Vasquez, who read it once and then read it again, and then leaned back in her chair with a smile that held no warmth and no humor, but something far more dangerous, which was certainty. She had been waiting for this, and she had been waiting for 15 years, and every ship that had been built, and every weapon that had been designed, and every sailor and marine who had been trained, had been prepared for exactly this moment, because Elara Vasquez understood something that the rest of the galaxy did not yet understand about humanity. They had not been building in the dark, because they were afraid, and they had not been building because they were ambitious, and they had not been building because they wanted to prove themselves to ancient civilizations that looked down on them. They had been building because they had seen the Vraxith coming, and they had recognized what the Vraxith were, because humanity had a very long and very bloody history, and they knew exactly what a predator looked like when it was hunting. Vasquez turned to her command staff and said 3 words that would change the history of the galaxy forever. Activate Battle Group Prometheus. Behind her, the main display wall came alive, and it showed the full scope of what humanity had created in secret. And it was 4,200 warships arranged in perfect formation, from fast and deadly corvettes to heavy cruisers bristling with weapons, to carrier groups surrounded by clouds of fighter craft. And at the center of it all was the dreadnought-class UTS Manifest Destiny, which was 14 kilometers long and carried enough firepower to crack a planet's crust. And it was the single most powerful warship ever constructed by any species in the known galaxy. And nobody outside of Earth had ever seen it. Vasquez opened a channel to the Concorde, and her message was simple and polite. And it said that the United Terran Federation accepted the request for assistance, and that Battle Group Prometheus would arrive at the Velhari Nebula staging area within 3 weeks. She did not tell them what was coming, because she wanted them to see it for themselves. 3 weeks passed, and in that time, the mood at the Velhari Nebula staging area shifted between desperate hope and bitter skepticism, depending on which species you asked and how many wars they had already lost. The nebula itself was a vast cloud of purple and gold gas that stretched across several light-years, and it had been chosen as the Concorde's forward staging point because the dense particles interfered with Vraxith sensor drones and gave the Allied fleets a place to hide and lick their wounds and try to figure out how to win a war they were losing. Drethon had arrived with 47 Morvathi warships, and they were impressive vessels covered in ceremonial battle scarring and armed with plasma lances that could cut through heavy armor. The Morvathi were proud of their fleet because they were proud of everything they did, and Drethon had made it very clear to anyone who would listen that he intended to lead the assault on the Kessera corridor himself. Of what the humans brought to the table, he expected the humans to bring perhaps a few hundred ships at most, and probably outdated ones at that, because in his experience, young species always overestimated their own capabilities, and he had seen it before with the Tessari and the Corvathi, and every other newcomer that thought they could fight in a real war. The other Concord officers shared similar expectations, and the general consensus was that the human fleet would be small and enthusiastic and ultimately irrelevant, and that the real work would still fall to the established military powers of the Concord. Then the humans arrived. There was no gradual approach, and no advanced scout ships, and no preliminary communication requesting permission to enter the staging area. And instead, what happened was that 4,200 ships dropped out of faster-than-light travel simultaneously, and they appeared in the nebula in perfect geometric formation, like a wall of iron materializing from nothing. Every sensor station in the staging area screamed warnings at once, and for a terrible moment, every Concord officer thought they were under attack, because no fleet in the history of galactic warfare had ever performed a synchronized FTL exit of that scale with that level of precision. And the accepted military doctrine across all species held that coordinated FTL drops were limited to groups of perhaps 50 ships at most, before the calculations became too complex and the margin for error too deadly. The humans had done it with over 4,000, and not a single ship was out of position. And the formation was so tight and so exact that the Morvathi navigation officer on Drethon's bridge stared at his readings for a full 30 seconds before he whispered that this was supposed to be impossible. And then they got their first look at the ships themselves. Human warships were not beautiful, and they were not elegant. None of the graceful curves and artistic lines that characterized the vessels of older species, and instead, they were angular and blunt, and covered in layers of reactive armor plating that gave them the appearance of something that had been built not to impress, but to survive and to kill. Every surface bristled with weapons and sensor arrays and point defense turrets and launch bays, and the ships were painted in dark matte colors that absorbed light rather than reflecting it, and they moved through space with a mechanical precision that felt almost predatory, like wolves entering a clearing where sheep had been sleeping. The flagship was the worst of all, and the UTS Manifest Destiny was so large that it distorted the sensor displays of ships nearby. And it was 14 kilometers of pure, concentrated military power, and its hull was scarred with testing marks from its own weapons trials. And it carried main battery guns that the Concord's best analysts could not even identify, because the technology did not match anything in their databases. Drethon stood on his bridge and watched the human fleet arrange itself with silent efficiency. And for the first time in his life, he did not have anything to say. Fleet Admiral Vasquez requested a joint command briefing aboard the Concord flagship, and she arrived in a shuttle that was itself armed more heavily than some corvettes. And she walked into the briefing room accompanied by 4 officers, and she was shorter than almost every alien in the room, but somehow she filled the space in a way that had nothing to do with physical size. She was calm and direct, and she wasted no time on pleasantries or diplomatic formalities, and she activated a tactical hologram of the Kesara corridor, and began explaining what she called Operation Thunder Road. The alien admirals watched and listened, and then they stopped listening, because they were too busy being horrified. The human battle plan called for a full-speed, direct assault into the center of the Vraxit formation, and not a probing attack, and not a flanking maneuver, and not a careful siege, but a straight charge directly into the teeth of 12,000 enemy warships at maximum combat speed. Drethon broke the silence first, and he said that this was not a battle plan but a suicide note, and that no fleet could survive a direct engagement against those numbers, and that the humans clearly did not understand the scale of what they were facing. Vasquez looked at him without anger or offense, and she said that she understood his concern, and then she explained the doctrine that humanity had developed over thousands of years of fighting each other on one small planet, and she called it by its old name, which was shock and awe. The principle was simple, she said, and it worked like this. And you hit the enemy with so much force and so much speed and so much violence at a single point that you do not just defeat them, but you break their ability to think and to react and to fight back, and you do it before they even understand what is happening. And by the time they figure it out, the battle is already over. She then revealed the weapons that Battle Group Prometheus carried, and she showed them the Mjolnir-class kinetic accelerators, which were railguns that fired tungsten slugs at 12% of the speed of light, and could punch through any armor in the known galaxy. And she showed them the Hades swarm missiles, which were AI-guided munitions that communicated with each other in real time, and could coordinate attacks on thousands of targets simultaneously. And she showed them the Aegis pattern void shields, which rotated defensive frequencies faster than any known weapon system could adapt to. The room was quiet for a long time after she finished. High Commander Zorath asked her how humanity had developed weapons this advanced in only 300 years of spaceflight, honestly, and said that humans had been developing weapons for their entire existence, and that space had just given them more room to work with. The Concord voted to accept the human battle plan, because once again they had no better option, and Drethon insisted that his Morvathi ships would participate in the assault, and Vasquez agreed but assigned them to the rear guard, which was a position of safety that Drethon recognized as an insult, but accepted, because something in the human admiral's eyes told him that arguing would be a waste of time. The fleet prepared to jump, and across 4,200 human warships, crews moved to battle stations, and weapon systems powered up, and targeting computers ran final calculations, and Marines locked themselves into crash harnesses, and said prayers, or told jokes, or sat in silence, depending on who they were and what they believed. Vasquez stood on the bridge of the Manifest Destiny, and the ship hummed around her, like a living thing eager to do what it had been built to do. And she opened a channel to every ship in Battle Group Prometheus, and her voice was steady and clear. She told them that in 30 minutes they would enter the Kessara corridor, and that their allies had been fighting and dying in this war for decades, and that today humanity was going to end it. And she told them that the enemy had never faced anything like them, and that they were going to make sure the enemy never forgot what happened when you threatened humanity's friends. She closed the channel, and the fleet began its final countdown. And across the staging area, the Concord ships watched the human armada orient itself toward the corridor, like a loaded gun pointing at its target. Drethon watched from his bridge, and he realized that he was holding his breath, and he did not know why, but somewhere deep in his warrior's instincts, a voice was telling him that he was about to witness something that the galaxy had never seen before. Hive Commander Skethra had held the Kessara corridor for 8 years, and in that time not a single enemy fleet had come close to breaching its defenses, and the corridor was a fortress of living ships and orbital hive stations and billions of Vraxith drones that swarmed through space like clouds of hungry insects, waiting to devour anything that entered their territory. Skethra was connected to every ship in its fleet through the Hive Link, which was a psychic network that allowed the Vraxith to coordinate their forces with a speed and precision that no other species could match. And through the Hive Link, Skethra could feel the position of every drone and every warship and every hive station like they were extensions of its own body. It had destroyed 3 Concord fleets in this corridor, and each time the pattern was the same, and the enemy would approach cautiously and probe the defenses and try to find a weakness, and Skethra would wait patiently and then close the trap. And the enemy would die, and the Vraxith would feed on the wreckage and grow stronger. So when the sensor drones at the edge of the corridor detected incoming FTL signatures, Skethra felt no alarm, and only the familiar anticipation of another meal, and it began issuing standard defensive orders through the Hive Link, and told its fleet to form the consumption pattern and prepare to surround and devour whatever came through. Then the readings came in, and Skethra stopped. The number of incoming signatures was over 4,000, and they were moving at speeds that exceeded anything in the Vraxith tactical database. They were not approaching from the expected entry vectors, but were instead aimed directly at the center of the formation, and the estimated time of arrival was not minutes, but seconds. Skethra tried to issue new orders, but there was no time, because the countdown reached 0, and the humans arrived. They did not drop out of FTL at the edge of the corridor, the way every other fleet in history had done, and they did not maintain a safe engagement distance, the way every military doctrine in the galaxy demanded, and instead, 4,200 human warships materialized inside the Vraxith formation, spread across the entire defensive line, appearing among the enemy ships like ghosts stepping through a wall. For 2 seconds nothing happened, and the universe held its breath. Then the humans opened fire. The Mjolnir railguns spoke first, and they fired tungsten slugs at 12% of the speed of light, and the first volley hit the 3 largest hive stations simultaneously, and the kinetic energy was so extreme that the stations did not just break apart, but exploded outward, in expanding clouds of superheated debris that destroyed dozens of Vraxith ships caught in the blast radius. The Hades swarm missiles launched next, and they poured out of every human ship in streams of thousands, and each missile was guided by an artificial intelligence that communicated with every other missile in real time, and they did not fly in straight lines, but twisted and weaved and coordinated their approaches so that Vraxith point defenses could not track them, and when they hit in waves that overwhelmed any defense. The human electronic warfare suites activated at the same moment, and they broadcast on every frequency the Vraxith hive link used, and the effect was immediate and devastating, because the psychic network that connected every Vraxith ship suddenly filled with noise and static and false signals, and Skethra felt its connection to its fleet shatter like glass breaking, and suddenly it was blind and deaf and alone. Across the corridor, 12,000 Vraxith warships found themselves cut off from each other, and surrounded by enemies that were shooting in every direction, with weapons that killed with a single hit. And the Vraxith tried to fight back, but they faced an impossible problem. Because the humans were not in front of them or behind them, but among them, and every shot that missed a human ship hit a Vraxith ship instead. From the rear guard, Drethon watched through his bridge sensors as the corridor turned into a killing field, and at first he thought the humans had made a terrible mistake, because dropping into the middle of an enemy formation meant being surrounded and outnumbered on every side, and for a moment he was certain he was watching 4,000 ships commit suicide. Then he saw the kill counts. His tactical officer began reading the numbers aloud, and the voice started steady, but grew increasingly shaken as the count climbed, and in the first 60 seconds, the humans destroyed over 2,000 Vraxith warships, and the number kept rising, and it did not slow down. The human ships moved through the Vraxith formation like predators through a herd, and they were fast and coordinated and brutal, and they covered each other with overlapping fields of fire, and their void shields absorbed hits that would have destroyed Concord ships 3 times over. And when a Vraxith warship managed to get close enough for a direct assault, the human point defense turrets shredded it before it could fire. The Manifest Destiny was at the center of the carnage, and it was a mountain of metal and fury, and its main batteries fired in a steady rhythm that shook the fabric of space around it. And each shot from its primary railguns punched clean through a Vraxith hive station from one side to the other, leaving tunnels of molten destruction through the organic hulls. On the bridge of the Manifest Destiny, Fleet Admiral Vasquez stood with her hands clasped behind her back, and her face showed no emotion as she issued orders with the calm precision of someone who had trained for this moment her entire life. And she directed her fleet the way a conductor directs an orchestra, and every ship knew exactly where to be, and exactly when to fire, and exactly which target to prioritize. She called out targets by designation number, and her tactical officers confirmed kills within seconds. and the bridge crew worked with a mechanical efficiency that would have terrified anyone watching, because there was no panic, and no hesitation, and no doubt, and only the quiet professional business of destroying an enemy fleet with systematic thoroughness. Skethra tried desperately to regain control, and it pushed against the electronic interference with every ounce of its psychic strength, and for a brief moment it managed to reconnect with a cluster of 300 warships, and it ordered them to concentrate fire on the nearest human capital ship. The 300 ships turned and fired together, and their combined plasma beams struck a human heavy cruiser, and the cruiser's Vord shields flared bright white and held for 4 seconds before collapsing, and the plasma burned through the armor, and the ship broke apart in a silent explosion. It was the first human ship to die, and it would not be the last, but for every human ship that fell, the Vraxith lost 50 more, and the math was merciless and absolute. The battle had now lasted 4 minutes, and the Vraxith fleet had lost over 7,000 ships, and the remaining 5,000 were scattering in disorganized clusters, trying to flee, but the humans were faster, and their weapons had longer range, and the Hades swarms chased down fleeing ships with patient mechanical persistence. At the 5-minute mark, Vasquez ordered the fleet to shift to pursuit formation, and the human ships reorganized themselves in seconds, and swept through the corridor like a wave, clearing debris from ashore, and the Vraxith hive stations that remained were targeted by concentrated railgun fire that broke them apart, one by one. Skethra felt its hive stations die, and each one was like losing a limb, and the pain drove it to something the Vraxith had never experienced in their entire history of conquest, which was panic, and it ordered a full retreat and broadcast the command on every frequency it could reach, and told its fleet to run and abandon the corridor and flee to the core systems. The surviving Vraxith ships turned and ran, and they scattered in every direction, without coordination or formation, and they ran the way prey runs from a predator that is faster and stronger, and has no intention of stopping. At 6 minutes and 14 seconds, Fleet Admiral Vasquez gave the order to cease fire. The Kasara corridor was silent. Where 12,000 Vraxith warships and dozens of massive hive stations had held an impregnable defensive line, there was now only wreckage and expanding clouds of debris, and the fading heat signatures of destroyed ships cooling in the vacuum of space. The human fleet had lost 340 ships, and every loss was felt, and every crew mourned, but the number was a fraction of what any Concord fleet had ever suffered in an engagement a tenth this size. Drethan stood on his bridge, and his hands were gripping the railings so tightly that his claws had dug grooves into the metal, and around him his crew was silent and still, and every single one of them was staring at their sensor displays, as if they could not believe what they were seeing. The Kasara corridor was open. 8 years of Vraxith fortification erased in 6 minutes by a species that most of the galaxy considered children. Drethan's first officer turned to him and asked what they should do, and Drethan did not answer for a long time, because he was still trying to process what he had just witnessed, and when he finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper, and all he said was, "What are they?" The battle data from the Kasara corridor spread across the galaxy faster than light itself could travel, and within hours, every species in the Concord had seen the recordings, and within days, every military academy and war college and strategic think tank in known space was analyzing what had happened and trying to understand how it was possible. The numbers alone were staggering. 9,000 Vraxith warships destroyed in 6 minutes and 14 seconds, all orbital hive stations eliminated, and the most heavily fortified position in the war erased by a single fleet from a species that most of the galaxy had considered irrelevant. Military analysts from the Poleni spent weeks studying the human fleet's FTL coordination. and they concluded that the mathematics required to drop 4,000 ships into a hostile formation with that level of precision would have taken their best computers several years to calculate. And the humans had done it in real time. Korvathi weapons experts examined the sensor data on the Mjolnir railguns, and they could not understand how the humans had built a kinetic accelerator that powerful on a mobile platform, because the energy requirements alone should have made it impossible. And yet the recordings clearly showed tungsten slugs traveling at 12% of light speed, punching through hive stations like needles through cloth. The Yethani intelligence service attempted to reverse engineer the human electronic warfare systems, and failed completely because the jamming technology operated on principles they had never encountered, and it had shut down the Vraxith hive link in less than a second, which should not have been achievable by any known technology. Every species that studied the battle came to the same conclusion, and it was a conclusion that filled some with relief and others with a deep and unsettling fear. And the conclusion was that humanity was better at war than anyone else in the galaxy. And it was not even close. The political fallout was enormous, and the Concord Council convened an emergency session, and the chamber that had been filled with despair just weeks earlier was now filled with a different kind of tension, because the species that had dismissed humanity now had to reckon with the fact that the youngest civilization in the room was also the most dangerous. Some delegates expressed gratitude, and the liberated colonies in the Kisara region sent messages of thanks and called the humans saviors and heroes, and the species that had lost fleets trying to crack that corridor acknowledged that humanity had accomplished in minutes what they had failed to do in years. But others were afraid, and they did not hide it, and the Peleni ambassador said openly that if humanity could do this to the Vraxith, then what would stop them from doing it to anyone else? And the question hung in the air like smoke, because nobody had a good answer. Ambassador Thalvine requested a private meeting with Fleet Admiral Vasquez, and it took place aboard the Manifest Destiny in the Admiral's quarters, which were surprisingly plain and functional, and decorated with nothing except a small framed photograph of a beach on Earth, and a shelf of old paper books that looked like they had been read many times. Thalvine sat across from Vasquez and studied the human woman, with eyes that had seen civilizations rise and fall over millions of years. And she asked the question that the entire galaxy wanted answered. How had humanity become so effective at warfare in such a short time? Vasquez poured 2 glasses of water and slid one across the table, and took a moment before she answered. And when she spoke, her voice was not boastful or proud, but tired and honest, and she said that the answer was not complicated, and it was not a secret, and it was simply that humanity had been killing each other for 100,000 years. The Vraxith used had already been invented by humans long before they ever reached the stars, and swarm tactics were something humans had faced and used since before they had written language. And overwhelming numbers was a strategy as old as the first tribal wars, and adaptation and evolution of combat techniques was something humans did between breakfast and lunch. She told Thalvine that human history was a catalogue of violence that would horrify any species in the Concord, and that humans had fought wars over land and water and food and religion and ideology and pride, and sometimes for no reason at all, except that they could, and that every one of those wars had taught them something, and made them sharper and more efficient and more creative in the art of destruction. The Silurian ambassador was quiet for a long time after Vasquez finished, and then she said something that surprised the admiral, and she said that she had studied human history before proposing the alliance. She had read about their world wars, and their genocides, and their nuclear weapons, and their centuries of colonial violence, and she said that what disturbed her was not the violence itself, because many species had violent histories. What disturbed her was that humans had also built cathedrals, and written symphonies, and painted masterpieces, and explored the deepest parts of their oceans and the farthest reaches of their solar system. And they had done all of this alongside the killing, and sometimes because of it. And this contradiction between extraordinary beauty and extraordinary violence existing in the same species at the same time was something she had never encountered in 4 million years of Silurian civilization. Vasquez smiled at that, and it was a real smile, not the cold one she wore in briefings. And she said that humans did not see it as a contradiction, and that the violence and the beauty came from the same place, which was a refusal to accept things as they were, a constant burning need to change the world, whether that meant building something wonderful or tearing something terrible down. Meanwhile, across the galaxy, the Vraxith Dominion was experiencing something unprecedented. And the Hive Queens, who ruled the Dominion from their throne world deep in the core systems, were afraid. And this was remarkable, because the Vraxith had conquered over 200 species in their history and had never once felt fear. They had watched the battle data transmitted by the survivors who fled the Kasara corridor, and they had analyzed it with the cold efficiency of their collective intelligence. And they had reached a conclusion that shook the foundations of their empire, which was that they could not defeat humanity in direct combat. The Hive Queens sent an envoy to the Concord, requesting negotiations, and the envoy carried a message that was unprecedented in Vraxith history, because it was a request for terms. And the Vraxith had never requested terms from anyone, because they had never needed to. The message was delivered to Fleet Admiral Vasquez, because the Concord had quietly, and without formal vote, deferred military authority to her, and she read the Vraxith request, and her response was immediate, and it was not diplomatic. She told the envoy that the Vraxith did not get terms, and that they got a choice, and the choice was to withdraw from every system they had taken from the Concord's member species, or face the full force of humanity's military coming for the rest of their empire. And she gave them 72 hours to decide. The envoy transmitted the message and left, and the galaxy held its breath. That evening Drethan requested a private audience with Vasquez, and he came alone without his guards or his officers, and he brought with him an ancient blade that had been carried by his family for 17 generations. He performed the Morvathi rite of blade acknowledgement, which was a ritual that had existed for over 50,000 years, and it was the highest honor a Morvathi warrior could bestow. And it meant recognizing another fighter as superior in skill and courage and spirit. And it had been performed many thousands of times throughout Morvathi history, but never once for a non-Morvathi. Vasquez accepted the blade with both hands and held it carefully, and she looked at Drethan and thanked him, and there was genuine respect in her voice, because she understood what the gesture meant and what it had cost a proud warrior to make it. Drethan told her that he had been wrong about her kind, and that he had called them children, and he had been a fool, and Vasquez shook her head and said that he had not been a fool, but simply someone who had not yet seen what humans could do when they had something worth fighting for. He asked her what that something was, and she looked out the viewport at the stars and said it was the same thing it had always been for humanity, was the people standing next to them. The Hive Queens had debated among themselves in the deep chambers of their throne world, and they had weighed the evidence, and they had studied the battle data, and they had listened to the survivors, who described the human fleet as a nightmare made of metal and fire. And despite all of this, they could not bring themselves to retreat, because retreat was something the Vraxith did not do, and had never done in their entire history as a species. Their biology was built for expansion and consumption and growth, and the idea of giving back territory they had conquered was as alien to them as breathing water would be to a human. And the Hive Queens convinced themselves that the Battle of Kasara had been an anomaly, and a trick, and a one-time expenditure of resources that humanity could not repeat. They believed that if they could draw the humans into a prolonged war of attrition, the Vraxith would win the way they had always won, which was by outlasting their enemies and wearing them down with endless waves of ships and drones and soldiers until the other side simply could not fight anymore. They were wrong, and they were wrong in a way that would cost them everything. Fleet Admiral Vasquez received confirmation that the deadline had passed without a Vraxith response, and she nodded once and turned to her staff and said 2 words: Operation Hammerfall. The plan had been drawn up before the deadline even began, because Vasquez had known the Vraxith would not surrender, and she had spent the 72 hours not waiting, but preparing and coordinating and positioning her forces for what would come next. But this time, humanity would not fight alone. The victory at Kasara had changed something fundamental in the Concord, and the species that had been beaten down and demoralized for decades had watched a young civilization tear apart the enemy's strongest fortress in 6 minutes, and it had ignited something in them that had been dormant for decades. A long time, and that something was hope. The Morvathi committed their entire remaining fleet, and Drethon personally led them, and he told his warriors that they would fight alongside the humans, and that any Morvathi who did not give their absolute best would answer to him personally. The Paleni sent 3 carrier groups, and the Silurians contributed their advanced censorships, and the Korvathi deployed their heavy assault transports, and even the Yathani, who had not committed military forces in over a century, sent a squadron of their legendary stealth frigates. For the first time in the war, the Concord was truly united, and they were united behind humanity. Vasquez organized the combined fleet with the same methodical precision she brought to everything, and she gave humanity the role of the spear, which meant they would lead every assault and break every defensive line and crack open every fortified position. And she gave the Concord fleets the role of the shield, which meant they would secure and hold every system that the humans liberated, and protect the supply lines, and ensure that no territory was lost once it was taken. The campaign began, and it was relentless. On the first day, Battle Group Prometheus jumped into the Vraxith border systems and destroyed the defensive fleets stationed there, in a series of rapid engagements that each lasted less than 20 minutes. And behind them, the Morvathi and Paleni forces moved in and secured the liberated worlds and began evacuating the enslaved populations that the Vraxith had been using as biological resources. On the 3rd day, the human fleet reached the Vraxith industrial systems, where their war factories produced the ships and weapons that had sustained their empire for centuries, and the Mjolnir railguns turned those factories into rubble, and the Hades swarms hunted down every transport and supply ship trying to flee, and the Vraxith war machine began to starve. Day, the Hive Queen sent another envoy, and this time they offered to withdraw from half of the conquered systems, and Vasquez rejected the offer without hesitation, and told the envoy that the terms had not changed, and that the Vraxith would withdraw from all conquered territory, or the fleet would keep coming. On the 7th day, the human fleet entered the Vraxith core systems for the first time, and the fighting was the heaviest it had been since Kasara, because the Vraxith were defending their homeworlds now, and they fought with the desperate ferocity of a cornered animal, and they threw everything they had at the human ships. The losses on both sides were significant, and humanity lost over 600 ships in the core campaign, and each one carried crew members who would never go home. And Vasquez felt every loss like a wound, but she did not stop, because stopping meant giving the Vraxith time to recover and regroup, and she knew from human history that a wounded predator was the most dangerous kind. On the 9th day, the Manifest Destiny led the assault on the Vraxith throne world itself, and the battle in orbit was savage and close quarters, and the great dreadnought took more damage than it had in any previous engagement, and sections of its hull were torn open, and fires burned in its lower decks, but it kept fighting, because that was what it was built to do, and the crew patched the wounds and kept the guns firing, and refused to give ground. On the 11th day, it was over. The last Vraxith war fleet surrendered after its hive link was permanently disabled by human electronic warfare. And the ships simply stopped fighting, because without the link, the individual Vraxith crews did not know what to do, and they drifted in space, waiting for orders that would never come. Vasquez gave the Hive Queens their final ultimatum, and it was the same choice she had offered before, which was accept permanent demilitarization and join the Concord as a monitored member state with no military capability and no expansion rights, or face the complete destruction of their species. She made it clear that she did not want to destroy them, and that humanity had not come to commit genocide, and that the goal had always been to end the war and protect the species the Vraxith had victimized. And she told them that if they chose peace, they would be allowed to live and rebuild as a civilian civilization under Concord supervision. The Hive Queens chose survival, and for the first time in their species' existence, they accepted a place beneath others rather than above them. The Vraxith War was over. In the weeks that followed, the Galactic Concord convened a historic assembly on Aetheris Prime, and representatives of all 34 member species gathered along with the delegation from Earth. And the purpose of the assembly was to formally welcome the United Terran Federation as a full member of the Concord. Further than simple membership, because the Concord created a new body called the Security Council, with permanent authority over military matters and collective defense. And they gave humanity a founding seat with permanent veto power. And this was an honor that had never been extended to any species, regardless of age or power. Ambassador Thalvine gave the closing address, and her voice carried the weight of 4 million years of wisdom. And she spoke about what the galaxy had witnessed and what it meant. And she said that humanity had shown them something they had forgotten, which was that strength without compassion was tyranny, and compassion without strength was surrender, and that the balance between the two was the hardest thing in the universe to achieve. And humanity had achieved it, not because they were perfect, but because they had spent their entire history failing and trying again. The assembly erupted in approval, and species that had once laughed at humanity now stood and acknowledged them as equals and partners and protectors. Fleet Admiral Vasquez stood at the back of the great chamber, and she watched the celebration with quiet eyes. And Drethon stood beside her, as he often did now, and he looked at her and asked what she was thinking. She was silent for a moment, and then she said that she was thinking about going home, and that she was tired of war. Drethon considered this and nodded slowly, and then he said something that Vasquez would remember for the rest of her life. He said that was why her kind was so good at it. Vasquez looked at him, and then she looked out through the great windows of the chamber, at the stars that stretched endlessly into the dark, and she thought about Earth, and its oceans, and its mountains, and its cities full of people who had spent 100,000 years fighting each other, and building civilizations, and destroying them, and building them again, and she thought about how far they had come from those first fires on the African plains, to this moment standing among the oldest civilizations in the galaxy, as their equals. She thought about the crews who would not be going home, and the ships that were now debris, drifting in forgotten corridors of space. And she promised herself that their sacrifice would mean something, and that the peace they had bought with their lives would last. And so the galaxy learned what Earth had always known, which was that humanity did not love war, and they had never loved it. And they hoped they would never have to fight again, but if the stars ever darkened, and if the peace ever broke, and if someone threatened the people they had sworn to protect, then they would be ready, because they were always ready. And for the first time in 10,000 years, the stars were quiet.